There are two broad types of carbon markets. The first is what I'll call a regulatory carbon market. And as the name implies here, a regulatory market is one in which demand for carbon abatement or sequestration comes from some regulation. There's some environmental authority, whether it's the US EPA or some state level regulator that says, okay, there's an industry that's emitting too much pollution. We need to clean it up. Okay, and the way this works, the way these markets are designed, this agency goes out and finds this industry that's polluting. You'll have to excuse the sort of cartoony animations here, but let's suppose we have a bunch of factories or power plants that are emitting too much carbon dioxide. I am a regulator that says, okay, we need to get rid of this carbon dioxide or at least limit it to some socially acceptable level. The way I'm going to do that is through implementing a cap and trade type program. I'm going to set a cap. A cap is just a limit on the total amount of emissions that can come from this industry. Of course, to be binding or to have any effect, the cap, the amount of pollution that can be emitted by this industry, has to be smaller than the amount that the industry emits prior to the regulation. But I'm going to set this cap, and then I'm going to issue permits in accordance with this cap. I'm going to issue one permit for every unit of emissions that I want to see this industry emit. Okay? And the way this works is that these permits represent the right to emit emissions. Okay? The principle being that if I'm one of these regulated polluters, in principle, I could emit as much pollution as I want. I just have to have one permit for each unit of emissions that I generate. When we talk about units of emissions here in carbon markets, that's usually like metric tons of carbon equivalent. So I can emit as much carbon as I want. I just have to make sure that I've got one permit for each metric ton of carbon that I pump out of my smokestack. Now, as I mentioned, the total amount of emissions that are generated by this industry has to be less than or equal to that cap that the regulator set. That cap is going to be smaller than the total amount of emissions that we generated before the regulation. So collectively, this industry is going to have to meet that cap, and they can do that in any combination of three different ways. The first is that they could just get rid of their pollution on their own. Right? So let's suppose I'm this top factory here, or whatever this is. Let's suppose that I don't emit that much pollution to begin with, and I find it very cheap to scale back my pollution on my own. I can just do that. Oh, sorry, I forgot an animation. Got me all out of sorts here. So we're the regulator. We've given out these emissions permits. Everybody's got their permits, and collectively we have to reduce our emissions to meet the stock of permits that we have. So let's suppose that I'm this top polluter here. Again, I find it very inexpensive to reduce my emissions. Maybe I can just switch my fuel sources. Maybe I can invest in energy efficiency schemes or whatever. I can just get rid of my pollution on my own and come into compliance with my stock of permits. Now, let's suppose also that I'm so efficient at getting rid of that pollution that all of a sudden I don't need all of my permits anymore. Right? Again, you need to have one permit for each unit of CO2 that you emit. So if you get rid of a lot of your pollution, you might be able to, you might not need some of those permits anymore. Let's suppose that these other two factories find it very expensive to get rid of their own emissions. They might go to this top factory and say, look, I know you've got these extra permits laying around. We find it very expensive to get rid of our own pollution, but if you sell us your permits, we can add them to our stock of permits, and that allows us to emit more, right? Since you got rid of so much pollution basically on our behalf. So that's the second way we can meet our emissions cap, is by buying and selling permits between these regulated sources. The final way, let's suppose that we're this bottom factory here, and we emit a lot of pollution, and we find it very expensive to get rid of that pollution, and there's no more permits that we can buy from any other regulated source. One final way that we could come into compliance with this emissions cap is we can go outside the market. And these regulations are usually focused on a particular industry or a particular group of firms. There are other firms that might generate greenhouse gas emissions, but they're unregulated. So what I could do if I'm this bottom factory is I could go to one of these unregulated polluters. Maybe they're a farmer. I can say, look, I know that if you adopt no-till or cover crops or some regenerative ag practice, that will sequester carbon in your soils. And if I can have some third-party verifier come in and quantify and verify the amount of carbon that you're storing in your soils, that can generate what we call an offset. Works just like a permit. I'll buy that off of you. I'll add it to my permit stock. And that gives me the right to emit however many units of pollution. And I can meet my my emissions reduction obligations in that way. So those are the three different ways that these carbon trades can happen and that we can come into compliance with our cap. And the key thing to note about this is that the number of permits or the number of emissions that are being generated in this market doesn't change. It's the same as the cap that was initially set. It's just who's doing the polluting and who's doing the pollution abatement has changed as people buy and sell according to their own benefits and costs.